Hello, everyone. Welcome to MCA 115 News Reporting. Today's lecture is about writing, reporting, and selecting news for the media. Let me share my screen with you and start this lecture. So I'm going to start a slideshow. As I was preparing this lecture, I was thinking about how much I love journalism. I spent 12 years working as a journalist, and this is my 11th year that I'm teaching journalism classes. I'm still not bored. I think this field is very exciting, and I hope one day when you graduate from college, you will really enjoy being a journalist. But at the beginning, I want to ask you a couple of questions and I want you to think about them. What is journalism? So, what do you think this job entails? What is it that journalists do? And why do you want to become a journalist? So, I want you to think about this, watch my lecture, and then when I finish the lecture, you just simply go to the discussion board and write an essay of about 250 words answering these questions. So you will find an area in the discussion board under week 2 where you're supposed to post this essay. So let me introduce you to the field. Journalism is a profession that encompasses the collection, production, and distribution of information to the public. So you see these three components. The first one entails collecting information because you can't just make up stories. That is not allowed in journalism. So you need to report stories based on the facts that you collect. That means talking to sources, in inspecting documents, going online to search for information, and so on, or simply witnessing events. So once you collect this information, you go through the production process, which means putting together your report, and then the next step is distributing that information to the public. Journalism is a very important profession. It is critical for a healthy democratic system. Because of journalists, those in power are accountable and should be accountable for what they do. When I say those in power, I'm not referring only to politicians and institutions. I'm also referring to big companies, corporations, healthcare system, and so on. According to a prominent American journalist, Tom Rosenstiel, journalism evolved out of the idea that people can self-govern as they can be free and lead themselves. So this is another element that suggests how journalism is important to the democracy. And because of journalism, it's not just important to democracy, but it's also important as it helps us build knowledge. So because of what journalists do, we know what is happening in our surroundings and the rest of the world. Now, what is it the journalists do? So what is it that you're going to write in your essay after watching my lecture? Because I really want you to not just, tell a story, oh, this is what I think journalists do, but I also want you to go over this lecture, to read the book and really focus on the key elements because that will help you develop your journalism skills. How? Because you're collecting information, you're collecting facts from my lecture, you're collecting facts from the book, and then you're thinking how to put them together in your essay and then share it with others, with your peers, and with me, of course. So what do journalists do? They select important information from diverse sources and then they put them together into stories. So their job is not to make up events, not to make up stories, but to deliver fact-based stories to the public. Stories that they create could be delivered through different types of media. That includes newspapers, magazines, television, radio. This is what we call basically traditional media or legacy media, newspapers, print papers, actually, television and radio, which are in the domain of broadcast. And then we have also modern media, such as internet, mobile apps, and so on. What happened in the 21st century is that new technologies affect journalism and how it is being performed. But I must tell you something, it hasn't really changed the basic rules of this profession. And what I told you about journalism at the beginning of this lecture, that it's basically, it revolves around collecting information, producing information, and then delivering that information to a wider auditorium. That is still the case. That hasn't changed. What has changed is all these channels and all these ways we have today to produce that information and to spread it further. Now, let's take a look at this pyramid. So look at these elements and think about them. So they're diverse elements that all, like, maybe as a journalist, you are expected to develop all of them. Maybe not all of you will be able to develop all of them, but basically these are really, really important elements, important attributes of an ideal journalist. So let's dissect into them. Let's see what these elements really mean. So we're going to start from the news judgment. News judgment refers to the decision to publish. So before you publish some news story, ask yourself, why is it important? And why is this story something that would be intriguing to your audience? So how do we develop news judgment? Well, maybe at this point, you are still fresh in the field, and maybe it's too early for you to know how to determine whether something needs to be published or not. News judgment is something that we develop over a course of time. So you definitely need to gain some experience in journalism before you can determine whether something that you witnessed or something that you saw online, or whether that an issue in the society really deserves more attention or not. So not everything you see is news. I remember when I was a young journalist and I was just like walking, and especially at the beginning, I was just like walking through the city on my way from home to my newsroom. And I remember like seeing a lot of things in the streets. And I would just come to my editor and tell them, oh, I saw this and this and this, and maybe we could write about it. But then through my conversation with my editor, I realized that not everything was newsworthy. There were some stories that they would want me to go and investigate in more depth, but some other stories just didn't deserve that attention. Over time, I realized why they didn't want me to cover certain stories, because they were just simply not newsworthy. But then, and why they wanted me to cover some other news stories that I proposed. But, I also learned something really important while doing that. And that is, even if it's not a newsworthy story, you need to really, as a journalist, show that you care, that you're thinking about it, and that you have ideas. It is crucial, because your editor is not going to be there all every time to like give you ideas. They will give you ideas, but also it is really good if you're a journalist who has a nose for news, and then you can propose something to them and then make sure that they're gonna let you they're gonna actually ask you to explore it further. Another thing is evidence. So you can't just show up in your newsroom and say, oh, well, this is what's happening. There's a protest in Times Square. And then they ask you, really, where's the evidence? And you're like, I don't know. Well, you actually need to show some evidence, and you need to show the same evidence to your audience. So that means take pictures, talk to people. You need to prove that what you know is true. And that is especially important today, because we have fake news circulating the internet. We have so much disinformation and misinformation that we really want to make sure that we are delivering the evidence of what we know. Another thing is storytelling. So you need to be a good storyteller. You need to know how to organize a story, how to tell an engaging story, how to shift from one idea to another without like surprising your audience, or without making them think like, wait, what's going on here? So it has to have a smooth transition, and it has to have interesting elements that would keep your readers or your viewers or your listeners engaged. Another thing is critical thinking. So make sure to provide context for facts. Explain why something is happening. So if there's no electricity in some area of, let's say, the US South, like, tell them what's going on. Like, why is it that people don't have electricity? Maybe there was a tornado or some other natural disaster happening there. So it has to, it's not just about like telling people, oh, this is what's going on, but you need to provide more details, provide context. Why did it happen? How did it happen? And so on. So we need these elements. Numeracy, numbers bring important facts about the economy, politics, sports, etc. Now, I must say that numbers are really important. Like, this is how many people died in a car crash. This is how many people were affected by no electricity in this region. This is how many people might be affected by storm. Like, these numbers are really important. And also they're important when it comes to other things such as inflation, salary, like minimum wage and stuff like that. So it's economy, it's related to also other areas, but numbers are really important. Sometimes numbers, and this is something that I learned. Maybe you are familiar with Reuters. Reuters is a news agency based in London. So, well, their headquarters is actually now in Canada, but that's the story. We're going to learn more about Reuters also in another course, the Global Newsroom, that I also teach. So, but I remember when I was with them, and they were like when I was being trained by Reuters as a young journalist, I remember them specifying like how to deal with numbers. Like, if we're dealing with big numbers in journalism, it is kind of important what they mean to an average citizen. Oh, this number is basically, this number means, I don't know, like 100 average salaries, or like it's your paycheck for a period of 10 years and so on. So it's kind of, especially when we're dealing this with big numbers, then you need to say, oh, well, you can buy like 5 houses in Florida for this amount of money and so on. So in some cases it's actually good, especially when we're dealing with big numbers that people don't really understand. Like, when you translate that into what you can get for that amount of money, then those numbers make more sense. So this is just the tip that I'm giving you, but in general, numbers in journalism are very important. If you are a journalist who is reporting about natural disasters, car crashes, about the economy, you need to provide numbers. People want to see numbers. I want to see what are mortgage rates going to be next year, and so on, for example. So I need those numbers to figure out what I'm going to do with my life. Another thing is technology. Technology definitely assists people in doing their job better. It assists journalists and everybody else in doing their job better. So it's not changing journalism in any negative way, but it's basically making things go faster and giving journalists more opportunities to report news in a comprehensive way. Technology is also reflected in not only like in the way we disseminate information, but also in like all the equipment that we use to report news. Another component of this pyramid is audio visuals. So they improve storytelling with audio, photographs, and videos. So you can improve storytelling with these elements. In some cases, to tell a story, it's better to tell it using a video, or it's better to tell it using an audio, and so on, or you can just create a story having multiple multimedia elements in that story. Now, let's take a look at some other more complex components of the pyramid. So those include civic literacy. What does it mean? It's not just about like going there, collecting information and reporting on events. To provide context, you really need to have knowledge about the system, the political system that exists in your country. You need to know the culture in your area, in your country, and so on. So you need to have basic knowledge about democracy, elections, how government works, politics, history, society, and power. They all help journalists to collect the right information, ask the right questions, and put their stories into context. So you need to understand the society that you um, work in as a journalist, and you need to understand different aspects of it. You need to understand how to interact with people, and you need to understand how important all of them are for your community, no matter their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. So you need to know how to report about different problems in different communities, not just your own community. And mission and purpose of journalism is being responsible towards society. You're also delivering knowledge to your audience. You're supposed to report freely, because without freedom of press or without the First Amendment, how can we hold those in power accountable for what they do? Now, there's certain terminology that I also want to introduce you to in journalism. They include byline. You might have heard of this before in some other courses, but a byline is basically the name of the journalist who reported and wrote the story. So if you open like a news website and you see, it's usually on top of an article. If you see Brian Smith or something like that, that means you're looking at the byline, and that's the reporter, the journalist who wrote the story. A copy is a written version or draft of the story. So this is like a piece that you will give to your editor. Your editor will look at it. Your editor will edit a copy before it gets published. Maybe they will ask you to add some information, or maybe to even rewrite your story before they look at it again and publish it. Dateline, it refers to the city or town if outside of the local area where the story took place, followed by an M dash. So this is one example how it should be written. So we're using all caps for the city or town where something happened, and then we're adding the state's name. So now I must tell you something. This semester in this course, we're actually also going to learn a lot about the AP style, Associated Press style, that is used in American journalism when we are writing stories. One of the things that I will introduce you to is how to write datelines. So not every dateline is written this way. For instance, there are big cities that stand alone in a dateline, such as New York City or Chicago, Salt Lake City. But for other places, especially for those places that might, let's say, there are cities in town in the US that carry the same name in several states. So that's why we need to be precise. So for instance, this is Peoria in Illinois, and Illinois, ILL, is how AP abbreviates states, this state. So it is really different from how the USPS abbreviates states. So keep that in mind. We will learn more about it this semester. Finally, the story lead. This is, aside from the headline, which I just skipped, I'm sorry, but headline is the title that summarizes the story. And right after the headline, there's the first paragraph, which is basically serving as a hook. It is telling the reader what is going on and what is the story about, what has just happened that a journalist is reporting on. And we basically summarize the most important information and present it in this form, in the form of the first paragraph or the story lead. So, how do we select news? As I mentioned before, you are going to develop news judgment over the course of time. As Bender said, news judgment is a learned art. So it's not like, oh, you enrolled, you are now enrolled in journalism school and you know right away how to select news. No, this is something that you'll figure out. And also, it really depends on the type of the news organization you work for. So if you work for local news media, if something is happening at the level of at the country level, so maybe you won't be really reporting about it because you're leaving that to all the big media organizations, or you're leaving it to news agencies to report on. But your paper will focus more on local events and so on. So it's basically really depends. You will learn what are major news stories, breaking news stories in the society, but you will also learn what specifically works for your news organization. So something that is happening in Alabama is not going to be interesting for if you work for a local newspaper in Connecticut. So we might disregard it unless it's a big, big story that has a national coverage. So keep that in mind. Also, journalists make selection of stories they want to report. So they collect a lot of information. A lot of information comes from news agencies such as Associated Press. So they have more resources, more stories than other news organizations. And then news organizations usually other news organizations subscribe to their service, receive all this news, but then journalists kind of make a selection of what is it that they're going to report on. They don't simply report on everything. They also determine the angle of the story, which they believe is the most interesting to their audience. So, what is it that they're going to specifically focus on in each story? So you will always find an angle like, why is this relevant to us? Let's talk about inflation. So which angle of inflation are we interested? Of course, we should cover it all, but maybe, in some stories you will find more economic experts discussing how we got to this point of inflation, or in some other cases, you will see a story with a different angle, and that angle is how this has affected ordinary people. So there are definitely different angles of the story. And the story needs to be interesting and important to become news. It's not just that you can report on anything, but it has to be engaging, interesting, because otherwise, how are you going to keep your audience engaged in that story? So I'm going to give you some other information about journalism and how we select stories, like how we select stories. How do we say, okay, I'm going to report on this, I'm not going to report on that? Well, there are several elements that usually determine whether we are going to focus on something or not. One of them is timeliness. We don't really report on something that happened 10 years ago, but we do report on events that just happened recently. So journalists provide reports on current events. They will write news about something that happened today or yesterday, not weeks or years ago. Impact or magnitude, journalists report stories that are important, that have an impact, or that affect large numbers of people. So it's the magnitude, as you can see for instance, from these two stories. The first one is an illustration that I wanted to use for timeliness. Another unticketed passenger attempts to stow away on a Delta flight this holiday season. So it just happened when I was preparing this lecture. So they reported on time about it. And then impact or magnitude, thousands without power as deadly winter storm, deep freeze stretches to Christmas Day. And this story was from 2022, but I just wanted to show you how actually it looks like when we decide to focus on impact or magnitude, like the number of people impacted by this and so on. Prominence is another important news element. So we write about prominent people, the US president, um, celebrities, and so on. And even when they do something random, something that random people, ordinary people would do, we report about it because it's interesting to us. So let's take a look at this image. I will just give you some background information about it. So this was in 2013. So the image is from Nelson Mandela's funeral. And our president at that time, Barack Obama, was at the funeral and he took a selfie. So now you're probably thinking, oh, it's 2025. So, who cares about selfies and celebrities, prominent individuals or presidents taking selfies? Well, the thing is that it was kind of interesting in that time because it was 2013 and it was a prominent individual taking a selfie at the memorial. So it was kind of interesting information, which is why ordinary activities can become news when prominent people perform them. And taking a selfie is definitely an ordinary activity. You've probably seen this one before. There are other news elements as well, such as proximity. It can be cultural, geographical, psychological. Cultural proximity, special ties to a certain culture, can trigger a country to report about the events and issues related to the culture. So you see, because of our special connection with Israel, special connections with Israel, we learn a lot about what's happening in Gaza, and we learn about many other stories from that country. So there has to be like strong cultural ties for us to report about another region, and geographic proximity. So we'll definitely go to report about something that is happening in Canada or Mexico that is like a big news story, because it's the closer the event is to home, the more important it is to us. And psychological proximity. So, people can be emotionally connected to a certain issue. I'm always, when something happens like a running event and I'm a runner, of course I'm interested. I'm kind of connected. I want to see what's going on. So if there is anything that you care about, like it can be some other activity or something, that is happening within your culture, kind of more interested in that than you would normally be if it's some other activity that you're not interested in. So that's why we as journalists are reporting on this. And some other elements include unusualness or oddness, unexpected or unusual events. I'm always like, let's see, I always see, and it's just an example that just crossed my mind. Like, I always see my friends from Florida, like they occasionally like post pictures of iguanas like walking around their yards, and I'm like, if something like that uh like happen elsewhere, maybe it would be like it's unusual to see, but an iguana in Florida is not unusual, right? But if we maybe saw it somewhere else, we would be like, oh, this is unusual. Or I remember, well, let me give you another example. Like, it was unusual when a coyote showed up in Central Park. So somebody posted that video on social media. It was kind of in the news because, hey, we're expecting raccoons in Central Park. We're expecting squirrels, but where where did this coyote come from? Like, what really happened? So something like, unusual is definitely going to be in the news, or unexpected drama or change. When I say a change, I mean like, like social turmoils, protests, and stuff like that. Conflict or controversy. When people disagree on something, it can be more informative than when they agree. As I'm like working on preparing this course, I've noticed a lot of like arguments among Republicans on how they should address certain immigration issues. And I feel that it's such an interesting debate, and I'm interested in it because I'm an immigrant too, and I've kind of gone through this process of getting H-1B visa and then a green card and so on. So I'm like, I'm just interested how this is going to reflect on other people. And I'm also interested to see like different perspectives. It's like there's a kind of a conflict among them about how it should be resolved. And all these tensions make stories dramatic and interesting to read. So as you can see, like with the example of visas, in my case, it's kind of psychological proximity because I'm an immigrant too. So I kind of want to see how this can reflect on other immigrants. Even though I'm good now, I have my residency and stuff, but I'm also interested in that. And another thing is, I wonder how they're going to resolve the issue. So, okay, I'm shifting to the other side, and let's see some characteristics of news. Reporters look for humorous stories that make the audience laugh. When I worked as a journalist in Serbia in Southeastern Europe, I really enjoyed humorous stories, especially because I thought we have so many, and back then we had, and today we have so many problems in the society that it it can be a bit toxic to watch all this serious news, but then like it's good from time to time just to find something interesting, something funny, to take a break from all these serious news stories. Journalists report straightforward events like fires, storms, assassinations, and so on to help people learn about what is happening not only in their community, but also in the world. They investigate complex issues that affect individuals and communities like healthcare, benefits of nuclear power, and so on. And also, when we look at the types of news, there are two types. One is hard news, and another one is soft news. So I provided here two examples of hard and soft news. Hard news are basically serious and timely stories about important topics that inform and educate, such as accidents, fire, press conferences, elections, and so on. On the other hand, soft news are feature or human interest stories that we're going to talk about later this semester, as well as entertainment, sports, etc. And I provided these two examples, at least one that after severe weather moved through Eastern Texas, and then another story is about Simone Biles. So it's kind of, as you can see, like it's very soft news are on the entertainment side, sports, and so on, while hard news represents serious events. Now, some other things in journalism that you need to be aware of are some other important elements are objectivity. So news stories must be free of bias and opinion, where this is sometimes hard to achieve because all of us, we have our personal biases when we write a story. Maybe they can interfere with facts, but we should not allow that. We need to be neutral and provide facts from important sources that are relevant for the story. I'll talk more about objectivity in class, and I want to touch upon a lot of important issues regarding objectivity because there's a lot of debate on this concept. In journalism, accuracy is another one. This is crucial. You need to report facts precisely and correctly. Newsworthiness, events are newsworthy if they incorporate some or all the elements of news. And we talked about these elements, and I'll go over them again at the end of this lecture. So now let's look at what is not important to us journalists. What are not newsworthy events? They include, we don't want to include any offensive details, avoid things that are in poor taste or obscene. Sensationalism, you will see this in tabloid newspapers, but it's not good. It doesn't represent healthy journalism. Exaggerating story is not going to contribute to either good journalism or democracy. That is basically our goal. Our mission and our purpose is to be responsible to society, to inform them regarding relevant topics in an accurate, objective manner. So we don't want to exaggerate any facts. Rumors, journalists investigate rumors, but if they find no evidence, they do not report on them. Sexual assault, journalists refuse to identify victims of sexual assault. So no, not even, you shouldn't even use initials if that can in any way identify that victim. So be aware of this. Names of juveniles, media do not identify juveniles accused of or found guilty of a crime unless they are tried as adults for a serious offense such as murder. And finally, what is it that every news story should answer? So every news story in journalism, maybe you're familiar with this concept, but if you're not, if you're hearing it for the first time, that's completely okay because we're in this course in news reporting to learn. So if we look at what are some of the answers that your story needs to provide, these are the questions. So we in journalism, we ask ourselves the following things. Who is involved and affected with this, by this event? What happened? When did this happen? Where did it happen? Why? So why is actually providing the context of an event and how did it happen? So these are crucial questions and we'll work on them at other meetings. So we'll definitely talk about this and you'll write a story, making sure that not just one, you'll write multiple stories, making sure that you have provided answers to all these questions. Now, at the end of this lecture, I want to remind you of the main concepts we have covered today. So this is a brief lecture that you need to watch before we meet in person. And I'm going to go into more details and I'll make sure to provide more examples when we meet in person. So let's take a look at the lecture. And what is it that we learned today? Journalism is about news gathering, news production, and news dissemination or distribution. What kind of competencies should we have in journalism? So they include news judgment that we develop over time as we perform our journalism duties, good storytelling, critical thinking, evidence, utilizing technologies to tell good stories, understanding how the society works, how the democratic system works, and so on. What are important terms to know in journalism? It's a byline, headline, copy, lead, and dateline. So what does each refer to? Think about it. What's the byline? The name of the journalist who wrote a story, the story that you're reading. News elements that we look into when we decide whether we're going to report on something or not include timeliness. So we don't report about something that happened 10 years ago unless we were not aware of that 10 years ago, but we just discovered it. So then we're going to report on it. Oh, this event, we didn't know about this until today. Then we're going to report. Otherwise, we want to report about what happened today. Types of news. So other news elements aside from timeless include impact, proximity, prominence. We write about prominent people, prominent events, unusualness, and conflict. And then types of news, hard and soft. Hard news refer to serious stories, events such as accidents, politics, economy, and so on. And then soft news are illuminated in news about entertainment industry or sports. And in journalism, we focus, when we write reports, we want to make sure that we are going to answer 5 questions, actually 6 questions, 5 W's plus H. Who, what, where, when, why, 5 W's plus H, and the H is how. How and why actually contribute to the context of an event that you're presenting. That is all I had for you for today. Thank you very much for listening. I enjoyed delivering this lecture. If you have any questions for me before we meet, just feel free to email me. Have a great day.